please welcome her to the podium.
Well, I would like to, of course, thank Professor Walter Edwards and the Humanities Center for providing such a holistic introduction to my life and my scholarly activities. And to tell you the truth, I had even forgotten some parts of my biography that he was introducing today. So it's interesting to have a reminder or a periodic reminder of the kinds of things that happened between when I first joined Wayne State in 2013 and now. Thank you so much for also hosting my scholarship for 2 years in the premises of the Humanities Center. This has been a great time. It allowed me to connect with other like-minded scholars and improve the quality of my work and make sure that my publications get out and get cited. Also, thank you so much for repeatedly supporting my work financially and giving me an opportunity to get my research agenda started. So I really owe a lot to the Humanities Center. And I would like to take this opportunity to advertise the numerous programs the Humanities Center has. So there is an annual residency, so several scholars here in the room took advantage of this residency from my department and from other departments as well. I would highly recommend. You get a great space, you get access to other intellectuals, it's very quiet, it's very conducive to a working environment, but you also get to interact with the director and staff of the Humanities Center, who make sure that you don't get bored and isolated during all this time that you spend there. And Humanities Centers, I know that there is also several of my MP students here, so thank you for coming to the presentation. And Humanities Center, by the way, has some funding opportunities for students as well. Whether there's a conference travel or dissertation writing, some of this might even be available to master students who are interested in research. So take a look, there's a lot of resources, and support the Humanities Center at the end of the year, because humanities always suffer, and they always need public support and citizen engagement. So I'm quite excited to be here today. As I mentioned at the beginning, I had 2 emergencies, so I have a sick child and my brakes failed. But because I live in downtown Detroit, I was actually able to make it here using some of the advances in public transportation, so the queue line and the people mover. So it worked out, and there is several reasons why I am excited to present this research. In part because this topic falls a little bit outside of my mainstream research agenda. So Walter expressed or spent a lot of time introducing all of my publications, and you probably noticed that most of my publications are on sustainability and the organizations that belong to the arts and culture sector and humanities. So my mainstream research agenda is about researching the kinds of contributions that arts and humanities organizations make to advancing societal sustainability, and also researching the kinds of struggles that these organizations themselves face while trying to survive and sustain. So it's interesting to be here today to present a different angle of my somewhat related research to a new audience. But it's also quite exciting because originally I am from Ukraine, and I lived in Ukraine for nearly 30 years. And in my time there, I did work for several non-profit organizations, including in the fields of arts and culture and youth development. And I also worked for several governmental organizations, the Parliament of Ukraine and the Ministry of Culture and Tourism of Ukraine. And I had numerous opportunities to interact with non-profit sector organizations. So by developing this part of my research, I was able to move myself from this position of a non-profit practitioner into the position of somebody who researches non-profit organizations in that part of the world. So there is this personal connection that I have. I do know the sector and some of the internal dynamics, especially in Ukraine. So that was a natural opportunity for me to collaborate with other scholars and produce this volume. So the volume finally got published. So the article that I'm presenting today actually came out from this volume, and we're hoping to publish it as a separate piece because it's a follow-up to the volume. The book itself, I have the book here. So for those of you who are interested in taking a look at the table of contents, feel free to do so. I hope that the library will be able to purchase the book. If not, feel free to send me an email, and I might be able to share some chapters with you individually if there are some chapters that you're interested in. So what this research is about. Also, I would like to mention Wayne State's colloquium committee and Professor Yuming Sheng, who is somewhere in the back, for co-sponsoring this talk. Thank you so much. for advertising and for using this talk to launch the colloquium series for this semester. So what this talk is about is really the process of democratization that many scholars and practitioners have been interested in for at least 50 years. And we have scholars from political science, from sociology, from history, from economics, who are all interested in researching the process of democratization. And the kinds of things that people are asking in their research projects is mainly what makes democracy fail and what makes democracy succeed. And looking at the comparative environment and comparing different parts of the world allows us to shed a little bit more light in understanding why some democracies fail and some democracies succeed. To that extent, we have quite a few theories that we rely on. All of these theories are grounded in different fields. For instance, the modernization theory is one of the mainstream explanations when it comes to telling the story of why democracies succeed. So in a nutshell, the democratization theory, modernization theory argues us that by establishing free market institutions and relying on those institutions, we can produce enough wealth to be able to support other sectors of the economy and to be able to establish non-profit and civil society type of organizations that will make sure that the governments are run well and they're transparent, which is a critical piece of the democratization. So that's just one explanation, and this is the kind of explanation that's primarily advanced by economists and political scientists. Other theories argue that it's the design of institutions, local domestic institutions, that matter in terms of what degree of democracy we would be able to achieve. So Arendt Kort is one of the most famous scholars who does comparative studies in political science. But there are other explanations why some democracies fail and some succeed. For instance, sociological traditions, the work of Robert Putnam, although he is in part a political scientist, a lot of his work is sociological, but he argues that it's the quality of social institutions, non-profit organizations, social capital that explains why some democracies have advanced more than others. Either way, what we have been seeing in the last probably 30 years is the increasing attention of scholars across all of these different fields to the role of non-profit sector and civil society institutions in advancing democracy. Because that's a critical piece for democracies to succeed, and yet we have all these varying outcomes around the world when it comes to the strengths of the non-profit sector itself and how effectively the sector can support the transition to a sustainable democracy. Generally speaking, there has been some pessimism in the scholarship, especially looking at some parts of the world where we saw some progress towards democratization, but then there would be several steps back. So it's basically one step forward, two steps back for some parts of the world. So it's kind of sad for scholars to see that development, but that also explains why more research is needed to be done on why some democracies get reversed and what role non-profit organizations and other types of civil society institutions play in sustaining democracy or not sustaining democracy. There is a specific subfield of democratization studies that has emerged across all of these different fields, and this study, as well as many other studies, are part of so-called third wave of democratization. So the idea of the third wave of democratization was developed in a book with the same title by Samuel Huntington, and it essentially covers a range of democratic transitions in different parts of the world, mainly Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia, but also more recently Middle East and the transitions and reversals that we have seen in the Middle East. Within the democratization studies, there seems to be a special interest of several notable scholars to democratic transitions in the post-communist context. So the paper that I'm presenting today focuses basically on the countries of the former Soviet Union. They have had over 70 years of Soviet rule. So it is considered a post-communist context, although there was never communism in that part of the world, but there was some form of socialism, and certainly that is one of the contexts where we have seen varying outcomes when it comes to democracy and democratization. The one problem that we see with all of this scholarship is it's dominated by scholars who work in Western institutions and who publish in Western journals. And it's understandable because first there is a language barrier, right? So not that many local scholars who do this type of research can actually translate their articles at the quality that would be publishable in any journal in political science or sociology or other types of fields. The other problem is that just research approaches are so different that sometimes it's hard to overcome the methodological barriers. So as a result, the story that we have about democratization in those post-communist contexts is primarily told by scholars that work in Western universities, mainly in the United States, Western Europe, or Australia, but in some other parts of the world as well. And what we basically get to here is that we lack the perspective of the insiders who know the context to a much better level. So that would explain why we decided to do this Brill project 4 years ago, because we wanted to compare what the Western scholarship has produced in terms of the role of non-profit sector and civil society institutions in fostering the democratization and sustainable democratic transitions to the scholarship that has been produced by local scholars. More specifically, this is the region that we are focusing on. So we call the region Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. We try to avoid the language of framing this as a post-Soviet space, in part because our findings show that the origins of the civil society and non-profit sector or institutions in the 15 countries of this region predate the existence of the Soviet Union. And of course, Soviet Union had a huge impact. Basically, the socialist rule or the Communist Party had a huge impact on the state of the civil society. But there are some institutions that sustained the Soviet rule and preserved. And in part, this what explains such a variation of outcomes when it comes to parts of this region. So this is just a map of this region that consists of three parts. So it's the Eastern Europe, which includes parts of Russia, to Central Asia, which again includes parts of Russia, but primarily these are the three key Central Asian states, and the Caucasus. So this is basically what this region is about. So with this paper, we are pursuing specific 3 research questions. The first one is, what impact did the last quarter of a century have on the non-profit sector in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia? So basically trying to assess what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Because the countries all became independent and they took their own paths, and some people would argue, well, some of them are quasi-independent because Russia remains to be a powerful actor in the region. But either way, we do have all of these different outcomes that lend themselves to a very interesting comparative study that could be done in the same region within the same period of time, but looking at different outcomes. So what explains the regional variations in the non-profit sector development is one question that we're looking at. And finally, why did the growth and the quantity of formal organizations, so officially registered NGOs and non-profit organizations, didn't bring up much of the anticipated qualitative outcomes? So why do we still have some of these reversals, and why the non-profit sector is not as effective as it could have been? The study focuses on the 15 countries from this region. So they all took different socio-political trajectories, producing different outcomes when it comes to democracy. So the 3 countries in this part of the world, also known as Baltic states, are currently members of the European Union. And they have arguably made most significant advances to what we would define here as a democracy. And although there is more than one definition of democracy, the Baltic states qualify the most when it comes to the democracy. We also have hybrid regimes that includes the country where I come from, Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan. And those are also the countries that had what some of you may know as color revolutions. So it's basically a form of popular uprising where people self-organize and protest against the corrupt government and try to take the government down. So Ukraine had 2 of these color revolutions, and the first one went well, and that was actually the time when I decided to quit my job in the non-profit sector and join the government, because I did feel this public service motivation. Concept that we use a lot in my MP classes, and I wanted to be a part of the governmental reform. But the second revolution was not very successful, in part because it resulted in what some people call a civil war, some people call it a war with Russia, so depending on the perspective that you take. But there is currently an ongoing military conflict going on in the eastern part of Ukraine. But the idea behind that revolution was to oust the corrupt government that was able to resort some of its positions. But you can see that hybrid regimes have made some strides forward, but they also got stuck, or they made some steps backwards. And finally, in that same region, we have the examples of countries that could be described as authoritarian countries with different degrees of authoritarianism. Of course, Russia, that has reshaped and remodeled its governmental institutions to the extent that the same president can stay longer than 2 or 3 terms. So there is all kinds of things going on in Russia, but of course Belarus and several of the Central Asian states arguably have made the least progress towards democratization. It's also interesting that the scholarship, Western scholarship, uses all kinds of terms to describe the state of democracy in that part of the world, and one of my favorites is a democracy-resistant term that my colleague Maria Omelicheva, she is actually a Russian scholar, but she studies Central Asian states, came up with. So it's the idea that you try to advance democracy, but there is a resistance and something is not working. So when it comes to non-profit sector as the critical pillar of democratization, we do know that there is varying outcomes in terms of the number of organizations, how strong those organizations are, what types of roles they play in a society depending on which country of the region you're talking about. And there is also different levels of civic engagement, so how active the population itself is formally or informally varies in this part of the world. So to answer some of these research questions, the conceptual approach that we are taking here is basically comparing the scholarship that was produced on this part of the world in the last 25 years by Western scholars with the contributions from local scholars. So the basis for this is the 14 chapters in the book that we published, plus the 2 chapters that we published. Those 14 chapters represent 11 countries. Most of them focus on one country, but there is one chapter that's a comparative chapter. It compares Belarus and Ukraine, so the non-profit organizations. The idea here is that we would like to compare the story that local scholars tell and some of the conventions that exist in Western scholarship to try to answer the questions that I posed at the beginning and map some of the future research directions. So first, what do we know? There is basically 6 lessons that the existing Western scholarships produced in American and other universities tells us about civil society, non-profit sector institutions in this region. And by the way, I should note, so there is a terminological problem here because a non-profit organization, a non-governmental organization, non-profit sector could all mean different things. And here I use those terms as synonyms, in part because there is no clear distinction between all of these institutional forms in that part of the world. So the scholars themselves use all of these terms interchangeably. In American context, and this is just a little thing from my non-profit class, we typically rely on 2 types of organizations, either voluntary associations that rely a lot on volunteers and that are usually great in numbers, or non-profit agencies that are basically professionalized non-profit organizations that focus primarily on service provision. So you have that type of division in this part of the world too, but it's not as clear. And especially because the volunteering rates are relatively low, you don't have those large-scale voluntary organizations that produced democracy in this country 200 years ago, because those are the kinds of organizations that gave a push to this form of civil society here. So the first thing that we know is the huge dependence of non-profit sector on foreign funding. And at the beginning, it was not a problem because, Soviet Union collapsed, market economy wasn't there yet because it was a planned economy, it was a transition, there was no resources. So Western donors, Soros Foundation, European Union, and others came in and they provided funding, basically seed funding and training for non-profit sector institutions to get themselves established, because people in that part of the world didn't know what the role of that type of institution might be. The kind of problem that it creates today is that those institutions that heavily rely on foreign funding still, although funding has dropped, breed high levels of distrust to non-profit sector organizations. And several countries in the region, including Russia and some of the Central Asian states, for instance, passed a piece of legislation that calls foreign-funded organizations foreign agents, and there is a special type of reporting procedure that they have to follow. But also at the human level, one of our chapters on Armenia shows that there is a high level of distrust towards foreign NGOs that are funded by foreign organizations among local population, which also in part explains why the levels of volunteering are so low and levels of joining formal organizations are low. So the foreign scholarship sometimes avoids this type of lesson, but it does come across across a lot of the publications. So low levels of social trust. So this is Robert Putnam's argument and others. For the democracy to work, you need certain forms of trust to be present in a society, because democracy is about following the rules and respecting the rules and the social contract. There are typically two forms of trust: the generalized trust, so it's a trust in institutions and rules and societal governance, and particularized trust, which is found in small networks of close friends and family. So in this region, the previous studies have shown there is very low levels of social trust, so people don't trust in institutions. Governmental or non-profit in general, there is very low trust, but there is high levels of trust in interpersonal networks and informal institutions. So for those of you who are more on a comparative side, Robert Putnam published a book, Patterns of Democracy, researching southern and northern Italy, and that's the kind of conclusion that he arrived at, that you have a lot more interpersonal trust in the south and a lot more generalized trust in the north. And as a result, the northern part of Italy has achieved much more in terms of coping with corruption types of problems. And the southern part of Italy is basically like a totally different country, or at least that's the story that Putnam tells us. So you see something similar here as well. So because of this lack of generalized trust, it's hard to trust both governmental institutions and non-profits. Civic engagement and the role of educational system. There is, of course, this understanding that people should start their civic engagement and volunteering and participation in these types of groups early on. So in the United States, for instance, there is an interesting research that focuses on the predictors of volunteering, and it shows that forced volunteering, so when high school and other school students are actually forced to volunteer, actually has a positive outcome on volunteering later in life. So you see that. But in that part of the world, you see an opposite effect among former generations. So generation like myself, who were forced to be members of communist party organizations at the youth level, they're actually less likely to volunteer. And young people too don't show much of a strive, so the millennials, Generation Zs and younger, to volunteer as well. So the educational system doesn't do a good job fostering these types of behavior. Foreign scholarship also shows that there is a high prevalence of informal non-profit sector activities, meaning that there are sometimes groups and organizations that organize and pursue certain types of social goals, but they don't always register and file taxes. So that's something that we see, the informality of the sector. The impact of the communist past is huge, but it really explains a lot of these other tendencies. But what's interesting, it's not the only factor that matters. That's why it's interesting that we see such a variety of outcomes in this region when it comes to individual countries. So it's not just the communist past that matters, it's something else. But the communist past explains a lot of this, like low levels of trust and things like that. And finally, previous studies did get to the point of acknowledging variations within the region in terms of how much of a development the sector has achieved and to what extent it was able to support democratization processes or not, because that's what we're interested here. But there is no explanation or no convincing explanations as to why that might have been the case. So what do we bring to that story? So by focusing on both previous scholarship and the original contributions from local scholars, we were able to identify like the overall state of the nonprofit sector, and we were able to come up with three general themes that tend to explain why there are both regional variations and also generally low level of activism within this sector and low level of impact. We do see significant quantitative growth in the number of organizations. Some of it is fostered by foreign funding and the availability of foreign funding. Some of it is just fostered by the naturally growing levels of social activism. But we also see that despite the growth in numbers, even in the countries that are currently members of the European Union, such as Baltic states, the three of which are highlighted in this volume, there is primarily growth in numbers. So even despite the help that they even get from European Union, and despite the forced mandate that European Union places on them in terms of supporting their non-profit sector organizations, non-profit organizations in a lot of cases exist just on paper, and they have very low effect. We also generally find that the roles that non-profit sector organizations play in the society are quite different from the roles that those organizations play here. So this is theme number one, the non-profit sector and its boundaries. So what we find is that there is no clearly delineated boundaries between non-profit sector institutions, government, and business. And what happens a lot in this part of the world is that the origination of non-profit organizations is connected to the wealth accumulation. So some of the businessmen who are able to earn their wealth, they might start thinking about a political career, and they basically establish their own NGOs or non-profit organizations. They fund them, and they use them to get the national prominence and support. And in some countries, like Ukraine, for instance, has a mixed system where some people are elected at large, but other people have to be a part of the electoral list of a given party. So they would earn credit by establishing these types of non-profit organizations, and the party members will put them up on the top of the list because these are the people who have some sort of infrastructure that can support them. And while those organizations pursue important social goals, the real purpose is not to help the society. The real purpose is to help somebody to get elected, and sometimes those organizations decline after the electoral goals have been achieved. There is also very low level of corporate social responsibility in the region, meaning that business companies are not very inclined to sponsor these types of institutions for all kinds of reasons. But as the first example that I gave illustrates, like the government and the business and the non-profit sector sometimes is all about the same, especially if we talk about like major non-profits that get into the news. So that's a huge problem. And when it comes to the relationship with government, so in the Western context, there are three types of roles that non-profit organizations typically play. So that's based on the work of Dennis Young at Georgia State University. So it's either a supplementary role or a complementary role or an adversarial role. And in an ideal civil society context, non-profit organizations will play all three sets of roles. So when it's necessary, they will partner with government to achieve common goals. When the government doesn't provide a certain type of goals, they will step in and they will basically take this niche and they will provide a unique public good. Or when it's necessary, they will take an adversarial position and they will form themselves into what's known here as advocacy groups or social welfare organizations that are here registered as 501c4. So in this context, the only role that is at play when it comes to relationships with government is a supplemental role. And in fact, a lot of the non-profits are provided governmental funding, and they basically just work as a helping hand of government. They don't have their own voice. It is interesting that one of our chapters in Russia talks about that, but that would be the case in a lot of other parts of the world. It's just Russia has a little bit more free cash as compared to, for instance, some of the Central Asian states or even Ukraine. So they are able to support those organizations, but only to do what the Russian government wants. So for instance, they recruit young volunteers and they make them help with sport events and things like that, but they don't really care about non-profit organizations fostering active use that will monitor and censor the government. So that's the first problem, basically the lack of boundaries that explains why we have growth in numbers but not in quality. The second one is the three layers of barriers that exist to the civil society and a viable non-profit sector that include macro or policy level, meso or organizational level, or micro level. So the macro barrier is the lack of proper legal and institutional framework. One of our reviewers, who is a prominent scholar of the region, when he reviewed our book, he was asking why so many chapters talk about the interpretation of legislation. In the United States context, only the tax legislation seems to explain why the organizations are active or not. So here groups form and they pursue their mission and they don't care about legal framework, while in that part of the world everyone seems to be talking about laws. Well, I mean, that's one of our findings actually, is because how healthy the sector is depends so much on enabling or restricting legislation. So one of the chapters compares Belarus and Ukraine, and it specifically does the overview of the legal framework, and you can see that in Belarus there were certain legal restrictions on the size of non-profit sector organizations that made it impossible for some of those organizations to grow to the extent that they can actually be effective. And then there is a law that I mentioned at the beginning, foreign agents law, that restricts the access to foreign funding and handicaps some of the organizations that still get foreign funding. So we do have a slightly different story that wasn't voiced in the previous scholarship. It's the importance of the legal framework itself in either fostering, helping the sector to develop or preventing it from developing. The meso-level barriers are organizational barriers. So it's basically the lack of funding and resources that don't allow those organizations to grow and sustain. In part because there is very few donors that work in that part of the world and the foreign funding has been exiting, but in part also because there is no laws supporting private philanthropy. So there is a lack of institutionalization when it comes to private philanthropy, and there is no culture of private philanthropy. To that extent, people are more inclined to help their family and friends rather than donate money to an environmental or other kind of non-profit. So because of that, independent non-profit organizations, not the ones that are created by people who have their self-interested goals, are actually rarely able to raise the levels of capacity needed to sustain and have a larger social impact. And another interesting thing that we see in this part of the world, and for instance, Susan Rose Ackermann, who wrote a foreword for this book, she is a very famous scholar of comparative civil society. She is based in Yale University. She was very excited to read this book, and she basically told us, well, I research other comparative contexts, but what you're finding is very similar to my work as well, is that sometimes citizens in these countries view non-profit sector institutions as an employment opportunity first and foremost, because if you have a foreign funding or a governmental grant, that means there is a stable job, while the local economy is unable to support these types of jobs as much. Especially if people know foreign languages, they tend to go into the sector. I mean, that in part happened to me as well, because I was working for a domestic non-profit, but then a position opened as an international development non-profit, and it was quite easy for me to get a job, and it was a way better job than I ever had in Ukraine working for Ukrainian government. So taking a governmental position was actually taking a pay cut for me. And it's very common. And that explains why we have this type of meso barriers. And finally, the micro barriers are consistent with the scholarship that others have produced. Basically, low levels of generalized trust and low levels of public trust explain why people are not as active. In part because people are busy pursuing their economic goals or trying to survive, or as in the eastern Ukraine, you know, it's a war zone. So there are other types of goals that people have short of joining some of these non-profit institutions. And finally, the third theme that explains the growth in number but not in the quality is the prevalence of informal and traditional institutions. So the informality was discussed extensively in the previous literature on this region, but people didn't pay much attention to the traditional institutions. And it's understandable because for Western scholars it's quite hard to go do the kind of ethnographic research that local scholars sometimes can do. So several of our chapters specifically discuss the role of informal and traditional institutions. For instance, there is an institution of Aksakal that existed way before Soviet Union in several Central Asian countries, and the goal is to serve as a local dispute resolution mechanism. So it's basically like a council of elders, so you have to be elected, and it's a secular institution. Although those countries rely on Islam as the growing religion, it has nothing to do with religion. It's basically the civic institution. And what's interesting, it serves the dispute resolution functions when local government fails. So people would rather go and ask an elder part of the Aksakal to provide the mediation rather than they would ask a governmental official. So it's a very powerful term of informal civil society. Or in Azerbaijan or in some other countries that have an Islamic tradition, there are also Islamic institutions such as WAQ. So I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this term correctly, but it's WAQF. It's basically a microcredit institution that again preceded the existence of the Soviet Union, because in Soviet Union there was no private property, everything was state managed. But the idea of this institution is to allow people to pursue their business and other types of interests by lending lending money to their enterprises if they can present a convincing plan. And it's also interest-free. So as far as I understand, and some of you may know this better, it's part of Islamic tradition. If you lend money, you don't charge interest. And I might be wrong here, but that's how those institutions work. And that seems to be the explanation that scholars who wrote about told us. One other example of a negative form, or arguably negative form of informal civil society is the Euromaidan, so the second revolution that happened in Ukraine in 2013. So what happened is, because the government was resisting and they were using force against people who were basically peaceful public protesters, public protesters had to organize, self-organize, and they organized militaristic type of groups that ended up taking over the government and governmental buildings. But those were volunteer-run groups, so they were based on voluntary action, and they were the ones who were responsible for kind of restructuring the government and calling in for early elections. So one of the chapters precisely focuses on the role of these volunteering groups in Ukraine during the second revolution, and it's interesting because this is the kind of role that non-profit sector organizations or groups are not used to playing in this part of the world, but it also poses larger questions about the legitimacy of the government itself and the possible takeover of the government and governmental functions by those types of groups. So there is a lot of interesting examples when it comes to this informality that we were able to discover through this work. So where does it get us? It gets us to the future research that needs to be done. Of course, we did offer the three themes that explain the growth in numbers rather than the growth in quality, but much more research is needed, considering the contributions that the law scholars have produced and what we know from the other literature. And we suggest that there is 5 specific areas where such future research could emerge. Of course, we need to do more comparative studies, and we need to make those not only into case studies, but we possibly need to make this into larger AND studies where we could survey larger parts of the population and members of these organizations to try to explain what explains the regional variations. We also need to further explore the 3 types of barriers that our work has identified. We need to develop the new theories, because the existing theories such as modernization theory and others don't seem to work quite well in this context. So there is a lot of room for developing new theories or modifying the existing theories to explain this type of context. One thing that we did note is that there is very little evidence of the involvement of non-profit sector organizations in functions such as representation and advocacy, and yet in a comparative context, in a Western context, this is key. That explains the policy impact of the non-profit sector and also the ability of the non-profit sector to keep the government transparent and accountable. So it's a key part to democratization, but it was very difficult for us to trace any evidence of involvement in those types of roles. And finally, we need to study more the informal civic engagement, whether positive forms of engagement or negative forms of engagement, because it's such a huge part of this region. At the end, I would like to thank my co-editors, David Horton-Smith and Svetlana Krasinska, with who we came up with the idea of the book, and we worked together. I would like to thank all of the chapter contributors, local researchers that come or are primarily based in this region, everyone who helped us to recruit the contributors, because honestly, recruiting people who were willing to contribute to this book was the hardest part, in part because of this larger distrust to Western scholars. So we had to use back channels to convince the best scholars to actually do put their work out. So that was an interesting process, and we learned a lot. And we would like to thank the 2 external reviews. So the book went through the rigorous peer review, and we had to actually address the reviewer comments before the book was published. And Professor Susan Rose Ackermann for the foreword that she provided for this book. I think we do have enough time for questions. So any questions that you might have, and if you have any special requests in terms of specific book chapters, feel free to email me, and I would be happy to provide access in the meanwhile, while the library is contemplating whether to spend $300 for this book or not. Questions?
Can you go back to where you were talking about the 6 lessons on civil society and nonprofits, and just go through what those 6 were again? Because I only heard 4.
You passed it.
Someone. Here. 6. This one. Is this what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yes, so I should have probably numbered them, but these are the lessons that we derived from previous scholarship. So it's basically the literature review of scholarship published in the last 25 years on this region, produced by Western scholars and published in Western journals. So the first one is the dependence on foreign funding, which is acknowledged as a problem. The second one is the low levels of social trust and the preference for interpersonal trust as opposed to generalized trust. The next one is the inability of the educational institution to foster civic engagement early on among young people. The next one is the prevalence of informal nonprofit sector activities, meaning that you do have some groups, but they don't always go for registration and getting a special status. The next one is the impact of the communist past, so the communist legacy that wiped out some of these forms of civic engagement or severely constrained them. And the last one is the larger message that there are inter-regional variations. So we do have the evidence of different outcomes despite the common history that those countries shared for the last 70 years before Soviet Union collapsed.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So in some of the countries, you found that faith-based organizations were a source of nonprofit organization and activity. Were those also the places where there were low levels of generalized trust?
So the low levels of general trust are true across the region. So they're everywhere low as compared to Western standards. So if you look like, for instance, since the World Value Survey and others, that's what you will see, or studies that are based on those studies. It's interesting that it could be argued, right, that the religious institutions maybe like subsumed some of this trust, and maybe they created an opportunity for people to trust more to the church rather than to other forms of organization. But that it was not necessarily the case, because during the Soviet Union, the church on one hand was oppressed by the government, but then the government also realized that they could use the church effectively to control basically people. And it's true more so, I would say, in the Christian Orthodox world, with the Moscow Patriarchy kind of taking a charge of that part of the world. It's less true with Islamic religion, because Islamic religious groups remained a little bit more independent. But the government still tried to infiltrate Islamic groups with their own representatives, basically like KGB type of representatives, who make sure that there is no tendency to take over the government or something like that. And that's actually, we probably should put this in the future research directions too, because one of our reviewers noted this, that we don't discuss a lot the role of religion. But in part because we saw that it was not the same kind of religious group as we have in the other context, and it was still very much dominated by the government and censored by the government, and in part because religious institutions in that part of the world, with rare exception, have not been taking on social roles, meaning that they will primarily focus on religion. But in the last 5 years, for instance, in Ukraine and in Russia, because there is such a huge discussion about like the importance of the church, and Ukraine has separated itself, so the churches in Ukraine and in Russia are now increasingly trying to position themselves as social actors, because they want to show to people that they do something useful. You know, they will help homeless or things like that, but it's a relatively new phenomenon, and if anything, it's fostered more by these political divisions and the church basically trying to stay in business rather than the inherent social mission that they might have had in the past. So I would say there is no direct relationship between the kind of religion and the low trust, because trust was low everywhere, but there are certainly variations in terms of how people are engaged in religious institutions and how they view them as a subsector of this non-profit economy.
I heard you mention the country or countries you're from. I don't know if I heard it clearly, and so I was wondering if you could just remind us of that and maybe say something about how that might have influenced your perspective or your interest in the topic.
Oh yes, yes. So I spoke a little bit about this at the beginning. So I'm originally from Ukraine, and I was like, while still being a student, I was involved as a volunteer in several youth and cultural types of non-profit organizations. And when I was an undergraduate student, it was like 1996 and up. So it was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was when all these foreign donors came in and they started providing capacity building, training, and development type of opportunities. So I joined a debate club that was fostered by Soros Foundation, and then I started working or volunteering for Soros Foundation. So that's how it was in many other parts of this world as well for people of the same generation, because we saw this as an opportunity to get civically engaged. And then I started seeing this as an opportunity to get professional employment, because this was a relatively stable sector, and the governmental employment, because of the high levels of corruption, was inaccessible. So to people who come from an average family from the southern part of Ukraine, the idea that you would ever be working for governmental institution was unthinkable, because you have to have known someone who would have given you this position. So for me, I actually did join the government after the revolution, because after the revolution, all of these people who were part of the corruption, they got out because they didn't want to work with the new government. So the new government tried to recruit people using the open search process. So believe it or not, I just sent my CV and I got an interview, and I was hired as a public affairs advisor to the Ministry of Culture and Tourism of Ukraine, and I was 25 years old. I had zero management experience, so it was interesting. But my story is not that uncommon, but it also shows this larger lesson, right? So the relevance to this book is that there is so much intermingling and interconnection between different sectors of the society that sometimes you don't have clear boundaries. Because ideally, if you go into a non-profit sector, you should be choosing this deliberately because of the distinctiveness of this sector and the different things that it does as compared to the other sectors. But that's not the case in the region, even to this date. So I would say that my desire to do this project, of course, was influenced by my previous activity and just the inside-out knowledge of working for these types of institutions and seeing how they interact with government. And then later when I worked in the parliament of Ukraine, I interacted with a lot of these organizations, so kind of more like government, civil society collaborations. So it was interesting for me from a practical point of view. And here, most of my research and teaching is on non-profit sector organizations. So it was a natural fit for me to do a book that talks about those organizations in my part of the world. Although, as I said, it's not my mainstream research agenda, but I do plan to develop this further. So I don't know, is that the answer to your question?
Yes, thank you.
So you can call this somewhat an ethnographic research in some ways, but I try to remain as objective as possible in trying to just highlight the findings based on analyzing other people's scholarship. But I understand some of them because I was a part of the system. And Ukraine is just one country, but it is the second largest country in the region, and it is actually the second largest country in Europe. So it's huge, and its significance in this region is quite important as well. Other questions?
You're giving me flashbacks to my 4 years in Mongolia, the same George Soros swooping in, TASIS funding, consultants passing out envelopes at cocktail hours with cash to fund NGOs to people who had no idea how to run an NGO. This trying to create all these volunteer networks, converting the pioneers to scouts. It was just this, and then suddenly having parliaments and government officials run by 25-year-olds. So that, but I think theoretically, tapping not only to Putnam, but you made that observation 200 years ago in America. I was hearing de Tocqueville that there was something about the social conditions in North America, being a settler country, interacting with indigenous systems of government that will never be experienced anywhere in Eurasia, right? So, can you talk about, that sort of aspect of what, I don't know whether that falls in the legal or the historic or just a resource issue.
Well, it's just the history of the non-profit sector is so different and so unique here, right? It's even unique as compared to Western European countries that were monarchies, right? So the origins of the civil society and the functions are very different. I actually teach this in my non-profit class. It's one of the whole class lectures where we look at the history and origins of non-profit sector here. But what we call today non-profit sector institutions in the American context are as old as the colonial period.
Yep.
But what's interesting is at that time or later when Tocqueville visited the United States, there was very little separation between public and private sphere.
Right.
So there was of course no legislation that would allow us to call those non-profit organizations, but they were there and they were meeting all kinds of social needs, educational, social service, forms of representation. Later on they fostered and helped the creation of American political parties. They fostered some of the middle-class driven governmental reform during the progressive era, but the idea is that they were the primary forms of institutions, but it was hard to classify them as either public or private, because what they did was the public activity, but they were also private actors. But also in a colonial period, United States didn't have its own governmental institutions. And then later on, there is this tension that emerges between local government institutions and non-profits, but there is very low separation. So only later on, in the beginning of the 20th century, when they separate themselves as a separate form, and in 40s and 50s they start enjoying the tax breaks and other types of privileges, they distinguish themselves as a sector. So it's a very different story than what you have here. But here it's like, where do you start from? So in my sense, like after the Soviet Union collapsed, a good start might have been trying to support the grassroots organizations that existed or survived the Soviet rule, but a lot of them were underground, a lot of them were quite obscure, so they would have been unable to meet the large set of social goals, which is why the foreign donors came in and they said, well, look, you can create this organization and we will help your government to write a law that allows registering these organizations. So I think it was a positive development, but because it kind of unfolded on its own and the non-profits in some ways grew faster than governmental institutions changed, and then some of the changes reversed when it came to government. So the government was unable to establish and protect the niche for non-profit organizations that would have made them into active actors. And it's kind of a moral hazard, right? So if you're a foreign donor, what do? Do you support them for a while and then you leave and hope that they'll do something? Or, so it is a good question. I mean, it's certainly something that international development community struggles. I mean, Mongolia is a good context as well. Yeah. So that's the comparative piece of the story.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Choice.
I have a collection of, I'll get this now.
They're compulsory.